Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first ARNECC podcast of 2026. My name is Aisha Dibaz Miar, and I am a research assistant of the ASEAN Climate Change and Energy Project, and I will be your master of ceremony for today. So before we begin our discussion for today, let us get to know better about ARNECC. The ASEAN Researchers Network on Energy and Climate Change, or commonly known as ARNECC, is a platform established by the ASEAN Centre for Energy through the ASEAN Climate Change and Energy Project, or also known as ACCEPT, in order to provide a forum of discussion concerning on all aspects related to the energy and climate nexus within ASEAN. On our previous our next series, we had dived deep into a series of episodes on nationally determined contributions, or we also know it as NDCs, covering topics ranging from the institutional coordination, enhancement of NDC ambition in ASEAN countries, up to the intersection between ASEAN climate policy and sectoral targets. And so for today's episode, we would like to bring the first episode in the series of just an inclusive energy transition. Focusing on national climate pledges, we would like to further dissect on one big question, that is on why countries delay their climate pledges, the barriers that complicate this climate change, and as well as moving forward with these targets. All right, so now that I have introduced the topic of our discussion for today, it is my honor to welcome you with our moderator who will lead our discussion today, Ms. Indira Pratnyaswari. Ms. Indira is currently a research analyst of the ASEAN Centre for Energy. And alongside Ms. Indira, I would like to welcome our guest today, Ms. Malin Aldal. Ms. Malin is a climate and energy advisor at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, which is also our partner institution here at ACCEPT. And I personally am very much looking forward to gaining valuable insights and perspectives from the discussion that we will have today. And I believe so are the participants of our discussion. And so for participants who would like to engage during the discussion later on, please feel free to submit any questions you may have for our speaker throughout the question and answer box provided. And so without further ado, I would like to call Ms. Indira to take over the session. Ms. Indira, I'll hand over the session to you.
Thank you, Aisha, for the short opening and also to introduce me and also Malin for this webinar session on a just and inclusive energy transition series. So, good afternoon, good morning for you, Malin, and good afternoon for everyone who is in Southeast Asia. My name is Indira, and I will moderate the session or the ARNECC podcast this time. So, as introduced by Aisha, Malin is my friend. She is a research fellow in Norwegian Institute of International Affairs or NUPI, and her work focuses on international climate governance, particularly on how the governance mechanism of the Paris Agreement influenced the behavior of government and also the state, as well as the issues related to the energy transition. So, hi, Malin, how are you?
Hi, Indira. I'm good. How are you? Thank you so much for the introduction and for having me on. Again, my name is Malin. I have a master's degree in political science from the University of Oslo. And as Indira said, I work as a research fellow at NUPI in their climate and energy group, where I work on climate and energy policy, and my main focus is on climate governance and the Paris Agreement.
Thank you, Malin, for completing my introduction, for your introduction. But maybe to give some context, to give our audiences some context, could you please share with us how did you end up with the in climate cooperation or climate governance thing? What makes you interested to deep dive into this topic?
Good question. I haven't really thought about it. I wrote my master thesis on the Paris Agreement. And then I got a job here as a research assistant back then. This is 3 years ago now. And then before that, I was, of course, interested in climate change, in what we can do to mitigate the worst consequences of climate change. And to me, it seemed like studying the Paris Agreement was a very good way of entering that field and learning more and how we can act effectively on climate change.
Yeah, actually, I'm pretty interested in your working area because last time we had a podcast collaboration with the UNFCCC, and we learned on how the Paris Agreement, especially the NDC document, can shape can plays a crucial role in the international cooperation of climate change. And I think one of our base reference to have this session is your based on your newly published articles that discussed on the delays in NDCs or contribution NDCs that reflects credibility efforts and not weakening ambition. And I think it's a crucial and important thing to highlight because due to like some situations here, there might be the delays and some people might frame it in a negative way, but your article proved that it might be a positive thing and it might improve the credential of the climate mitigation and adaptation activities between the ASEAN member states. So Malin, maybe could you share like a bit of what is the discussion that you discuss on your paper, just to give context to our audience?
Absolutely. Yeah, my colleague at NUPI, Kasper Schulecki, and I have been looking into just why were so many of the NDCs in the last round of submissions? Why were they delayed? So just to give you some background on the Paris Agreement, first of all, the Paris Agreement doesn't tell countries what their mitigation targets should be. The countries get to decide that themselves. And what the agreement does is it really mostly obligates the countries on procedural issues, like the obligation that all the countries have to submit a new, more ambitious NDC every 5 years, which is what we look at in our paper. Specifically, we looked at the previous round of updates, which came in last year after the global stocktaking process that was happening in 2023. And the initial submission deadline to submit a new NDC was in February last year. But actually only 16 countries met this deadline, which is surprisingly low, right? And since so few countries upheld the deadline, the UNFCCC Secretariat extended it to September. But by September, only 64 submissions were in out of 194 total, or 195 total, which is only representing 30% of emissions. And these were the NDCs that formed the basis for the NDC synthesis report, which isn't it's not a very good ground to build that report on when it's covering so low a percentage of global emissions. And then when COP30 came along, we actually saw a spike in submissions that got us to about 128 out of 194. And then I checked yesterday, and now we're at 160. So it's getting better. But the fact that so many countries failed to comply with this kind of basic procedural rule raises some questions about the effectiveness and the resilience of the Paris Agreement, right? And these are important questions. And one of the, as you mentioned, Indira, maybe the most popular interpretation, or I would say one of the possible interpretations of this delay, has been that countries lack the will to continue the work under the agreement. But what we find in our study is that these delays may not actually reflect this lack of will, but instead be a result of countries making an effort to better align their NDCs to domestic politics and also to improve the credibility of their NDCs, which is much more optimistic interpretation than the other one, and something that we can work more specifically to address.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point from you and your findings on your paper, Malin. But before we explore more on how did you came up with that result, maybe I want to share with the audience if they are new to the NDC. I think to the NDC. So NDC is basically a nationally determined contribution, which is consisting of the climate or net zero targets that has been decided by each national government. So the parties or the countries that is agreed to join the Paris Agreement has set their own target or ambitions to join the climate action globally. And if we pull back and look at the Paris Agreement, Malin, the NDC mandate was designed to have this ratchet up mechanism. So every cycle of NDC, the target should be increased than the previous target. Do you think this mechanism is now becoming a trap? I'm referring to the situation where countries might set ambitious targets but delays to implement them, which may weaken the credibility of their climate action.
Yeah, thank you for the question. That is absolutely a real challenge. But I think what I want to say first is that the flexibility afforded by countries with the bottom-up framework, where each country party gets to decide their own ambition level, has been a strength. It has allowed for an agreement with very broad participation, which is central to having a shot at an effective climate regime. And I don't think we could have gotten an agreement with such broad participation without this flexibility. As we know, the international community is made up of sovereign states. And if we are to have an agreement with as many countries as possible, it needs to be based on consensus in its rules making, right? Everyone has to agree for it to become for it to be put on paper and for it to become law. And I think it's very important to have this forum with this flexibility to keep countries talking and trusting and cooperating with each other. That said, I do think that overpromising could be a risk to credibility, but I don't think this should act as an excuse for countries to start backsliding on their emissions, which is something we're seeing in some countries. Different parts of the political spectrum talking about lowering the ambition under the Paris Agreement because implementation isn't realistic, is how that verse usually goes. But I think that it's important to remember that the response we would all be better off if the response to this instead was not keeping ambition down, but focusing more on improving implementation, right? If we are to prevent the most serious consequences of climate change, the ambition level needs to be at the level of today or higher. Yeah, and then again, I think that this flexibility in the Paris Agreement has done very well in creating the framework conditions for policy and technology to develop by creating somewhat of stable international expectations of a desired path forward. And I think it's important that we stay on that path.
If that's the case, Malin, is it possible that it is the cause of the countries delayed in submitting their NDCs, or like you said earlier, some countries like only 116 countries submitted their NDC. And
no, 16.
16.
Or by the deadline, yeah. And now we're at 116.
Yeah. What is the main cause, or why did many countries delayed submitting their updated indices? And does this delay necessarily mean that they are less committed to the climate action, or is there any factors that cause the delay?
Yeah. We did find, how do you say, we found 4 clusters of possible explanations. The first one is technical and financial. Sorry, I'm having some data issues here. My computer wants to restart. Sorry. Okay, let's return. Yeah, so the reasons that we found for the delay were pointing towards 4 different explanations. The first 2 categories are to do with capacity issues, with the first one being financial and institutional constraints. And the second one is technical hurdles. So these 2 things are related to capacity. And there are things like you need robust data systems to develop a good NDC that follows the rules of the Katowice rulebook. And you need to coordinate your whole government. And that could also be a challenge. And then there are things and issues on monitoring, of course, which is challenging for a lot of countries. And then some countries also changed their baseline for their targets, which again requires further calibration down the line because of this change. And then the third reason that we found was domestic political dynamics. And these are things like elections, coalition changes, and somewhat and green backlash, which is, as I mentioned earlier, when some political forces are becoming more skeptical to climate action than they maybe were earlier. And lastly, strategic consideration was also something that we found. And then since we saw this spike of NDC submissions before COP, this plays into this explanation of strategic considerations. Because in the theory, there's this idea of summit theater, which is that countries look for the biggest possible stage to announce their new targets. And that this is why so many countries waited, or this is why some of the countries waited until the World Leaders Summit, which was the biggest event right before COP started. And that's when a lot of them submitted their NDCs. So those are the 4 clusters of explanations that we found in our work.
Yes, I think I also read that your paper highlights like the 4 main barriers. I think financial, institutional, technical, and also some political issues there that is also contributing towards the NDC implementation, Malin. But my question is maybe how can you assess that? What type of analysis that you used to like analyze the progress, or maybe to resulting that to have that result as your findings? How did you make that?
Yeah, I can start by saying a little bit about our data. And our results are based on 23 country case studies, including the EU, that we have gathered under we have a project here at NUPI called the Pooling Power of Paris project, where we have organized these case studies. And these case studies are the basis for this new paper, along with reports from a committee that a UNFCCC committee that's called, what's it called, Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee. They issue reports on NDC submission compliance, and also some field work at the Bonn conference last year, which is a yearly climate conference occurring between the COPs. Yeah, and then the local experts that we employed to work on the case studies, they did this by looking into the whole NDC development process in each country, and also the domestic policy situation around climate more broadly. And there is, of course, no doubt that what's going on internationally influence climate policy making, but it's also important, we feel, to acknowledge that the NDC development and the NDC submissions are also a process of, or an outcome of, a very long domestic political and bureaucratic process.
Thank you, Malin, for your explanation. And I think what I read from your paper, you also you explained that the delays in NDC can show efforts to be more credible, especially for the countries, and not framing it as less ambitious. But I think the hurdles is especially for ASEAN countries. We still don't have a clear monitoring and also verification system to track the progress of the NDC, the implementation of the NDC. So, do you have like any suggestion, or how do you measure this actual progress based on the NDC targets or documents that country has published?
Yeah, absolutely. Monitoring is very important. But in our paper, we're looking at the procedural obligation to submit the NDC document in time. And then implementation comes next, right? So we're not actually measuring countries' implementation of the NDCs. We are measuring, or we are looking at why they were so delayed in submitting the documents.
And I think how do you assess like whether the delays are due to weak ambition or other factors?
Yeah, that's also by going in detail and looking at all the different country reports, where our country experts have worked in a, what do you say, in a multi-method, with a multi-method approach. Talking to other experts, talking to policymakers, talking to NGOs, and looking into the broader policy climate in the country to determine why were the NDCs delayed. And then what we did, we summarized all the results from these case studies.
All right, thank you, Malin. And I think I will go back to your research finding where you identify there are like 4 factors which delays the submission of the NDC. And maybe could you please like elaborate more on how do these factors could be could affect the delay in submitting the NDC, because especially on the context of the procedural obligation that they have to submit to the UNFCCC. How does it like the financial? How does it make sense of the delays?
Yeah. The countries are, the country reports are suggesting that the delays are a result of lacking institutional capacity and finance. And the solution to a lot of these things that we also suggest in the paper to overcome these things is targeted capacity building. Because so many of the obstacles are financial or technical in nature, we need to be very specific about our capacity building. And this could be supported by the UNFCCC Secretariat or international donors or platforms like the NDC partnership. And then another, because submitting the whole NDC is very demanding, right? Because not only do you need a target, you also need to include how to achieve the target. And you need to include emissions accounting and stakeholder involvement and all these things that perhaps take a bit more effort to put down and to do robustly. So another thing that we suggest in the paper, and this is a bit more controversial, is we ask whether separating the headline target from the rest of the more complex aspects of the NDC is something that could be explored as a way to reducing or to increasing procedural compliance and having countries actually show up on time. But that's a question that we have. We're not saying that this is necessarily the best idea, but maybe it's something that we should think about. And lastly, there is also, to overcome some of these hurdles, there is room for a climate leader to step up and attempt to maybe inspire or pull the less ambitious countries along with them. Earlier, the EU has been a front runner on policy, but there seems to be this seems to not maybe be happening that much more forward, or at least not to as big a degree as earlier. And then you had the US being strong on technology, and even though the US is out of the Paris Agreement now, I don't think we should underestimate the technology development that is still happening in the US. And then, of course, there's China too, which is very strong on tech development. But exactly what a front runner could look like depends on who you ask. It could be one ambitious country, or it could be a coalition of countries. Yeah.
Thank you, Malin. That is very, very clear explanation from you. And I think we have received several questions here in the chat box. But before we going into the discussion session with the audience, maybe I will want to ask if that's the case that you mentioned, that those aspects might affect the delays of the NDC. And then have you identified like significant delays between developed or developing countries? Is there any significant pattern that you found?
That's a very interesting question, and we will be looking more into this in our data material, so I can't really answer it fully. But I can say that what we do find is that both developed and developing countries are actually having issues with things like administrative capacity, but for slightly different reasons, perhaps. Whilst in developing countries, often or sometimes, ideally, you get external assistance coming in, right? But in some developed countries, they find that the expectations of NDC complexity are so high that they too often find that they have inadequate resources, and that this has been causing some delay in their submissions. But we will be looking more closely at the differences between developed and developing countries further down the line.
All right, thank you, Malin, for your answer. So shall we go to the questions from the audience? We have 3 questions here. that has been asked by one of our participants. And for the first question, are there examples where international support successfully accelerated or maybe impacted the obligation of procedural aspect for Paris Agreement or NDC submission? Maybe could you share the what country that has shown a good progress on it?
I am sure there are examples of countries who submitted early on with the help of external assistance, but I can't really remember any of them at the top of my head right now, unfortunately. A good source to look at who submitted when is to go to the NDC registry. You just Google NDC registry, and then you can see all the submissions that's come in, and you can see the date that they submitted on. But I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of examples of this, but I'm sorry I don't have the names of the countries right now.
Okay, moving on to the second question. Oh, before that, if there is any questions for all participants, you can just click the Q&A box at the top of your screen and then just type the question. So for the second question, you mentioned the four clusters based on your findings. Which one can be addressed most easily today, and where can international support make the biggest impact?
Thank you so much for the question. I think that a lot can be done with, as I mentioned, targeted capacity building, and then maybe specifically on sharing systems for monitoring emissions, but also maybe on ways of coordinating across governments to enable the country to develop robust data systems. And I think there's a role here for developed countries to supporting developing countries, and also maybe the UNFCCC Secretariat organizing something, but I don't think they can do everything alone, of course. So international donors could also play a part here. Yeah.
So you highlight three main aspects. It's about the targeted capacity building. Second one is sharing system for monitoring emissions, and the third one is way of coordinating between governance. I think those three are quite interesting points to be highlighted on, because reflecting to ASEAN's landscape in climate governance, yes, we do believe that climate is a multifaceted issue and it should be solved with multi-ministries also, which some ASEAN member states has not established interministerial, how to say, interministerial institution to like working together and discussing and join the conversation of climate mitigation and adaptation. But one countries that might be focusing on this interministerial is, I think, Singapore, because they have established an interministerial institutions that specifically discuss on the climate action as well as climate target. So it helps the country to keep aligned with not only the environment sides of achieving the climate targets, but also aligning it with other ministries' work. For example, to align it with the Ministry of Public Transport, for example, to align with the NDC, so that the platform, the interministerial conversation could share their perspectives and also aligning more on the targets. And I think we in ACE also are also still working on identifying and also raising up the concern to establish or to form this kind of conversation, which encourage more ministry to join to the climate to the climate negotiation and also the target. But I think it is also related to the ways of coordinating and the geopolitics of each country, which could maybe accelerate or hinder the progress of climate action and activities of each ASEAN member states, or maybe of each country which has agreed to the Paris Agreement. And I think this statement is related to my next question, Malin. It's about the geopolitical situation that we are currently facing on the United States and Middle East conflict and other conflicts that is going on as well. And in the middle of this uncertain geopolitical situation, how can global conflicts affect this climate cooperation, especially that is related to the Paris Agreement? What is the potential impact that could affect the agreement, or maybe how can it related to the climate activities for the parties?
Yeah, thank you. And very interesting on ASEAN cooperation across the ASEAN countries. I think there's a lot of synergies to be had by expanding that. I'm no ASEAN expert, but I would love to learn more about it. And on to your questions on the geopolitical situation. As I see it, there are maybe two things that I would like to highlight here. And the first one is, as you mentioned, the effects on the Paris Agreement. So, as you all know, the U.S. has withdrawn from the agreement, which means the agreement has lost a very big and important country with high emissions. But the US was also an important compromise maker, we hear from negotiators in the UNFCCC. But another thing that we're seeing as a result of this withdrawal is that a few other countries are using the withdrawal and asking why should they continue the work under the agreement when the US does not. And we have seen Argentina hinting at this, but maybe the clearest example is coming from Indonesia, actually. But however, in all of this, I think it's also important to remember that all the other parties are still in the Paris Agreement after Trump withdrew. The agreement hasn't crumbled as a consequence of the US pulling out. After all, they have done that before. Although you could argue it's a bit different this time, but still. And then you could also, another, I don't know, a point of light. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but the withdrawal came at a time when the most important parts of the Paris Agreement, we're done negotiating the most important parts. Those are settled. Excuse me. And also at a time when renewable energy technology has gotten very competitive, both in terms of price and in terms of quality. And the Trump administration will probably only be able to halt this by so much, I think. And then maybe over to some more general effects on climate more generally, which is that with all the things that are going on, climate change is just being pushed down on the agenda all across the world, right? Which is worrying. The international order is somewhat in an upheaval with Russia's war against Ukraine affecting Europe a lot, but also the rest of the world, and the war in Iran, very importantly, especially for Asia. And the Trump administration disrupting trade relations all across the world and also undermining the NATO alliance. There's a lot of stuff going on. And along with somewhat higher inflation and somewhat lower economic growth the last years, there is less focus on climate change. There's just less capacity to pay attention to it, it seems, both for policymakers, but also for the general public. There's so much going on. And unfortunately, we're also seeing less willingness from developed countries to set aside funds to aid developing countries when it comes to climate change and development issues. But let's not forget that the energy insecurity that a lot of big parts of the world are struggling with now, it's terrible. But it also serves to illustrate how vulnerable we are to fluctuations in oil and gas prices, right? And supply. And I think that more and more people are seeing that increasing the share of renewable energy in the energy mixes around the world would both be very good climate policy, right? But it would also be good energy security. It would improve energy security in addition to improving air quality and health more generally. So those are my thoughts on that, I think.
Yeah, I also agree with your answer earlier. And just to remind our audience that the US has withdrawn through the Paris Agreement. But Malin, do you know how long does it take, like from the first withdrawal proposal to like the real withdrawal? How long does the process take? The process takes time.
The first commitment period of the Paris Agreement, leading up to 2020, it took a year from you say officially we're pulling out, that you tell the Secretariat that. But now I think it's immediate. And even if it weren't immediate, the Trump administration almost overnight cut all their budgets, I think all their budgets to the UNFCCC and also to the International Panel on Climate Change. They were supposed to lead one of the working groups there in the process that reviews research on climate change. The US has been a big part of that, both in terms of researchers and in terms of financing it. And that dried up very quickly. And they are also not coming to the climate conferences anymore, even though it's almost, I don't know how long has it been since the second. Yeah, it's been a bit more than a year, but already after the first announcement, a lot of the financing and they de facto were out.
I see. I think this situation is what you refer as the political hurdles, where the political will might affect, the domestic political dynamics might affect the national climate commitments to the country itself, as you find on your paper. So what do the country needs to actually like to follow the procedure of the Paris Agreement so they can submit the NDC on time? And I think my one of my question is, why should they submit the NDC on time based on the timeline that is agreed by the UNFCCC or Paris Agreement?
Yeah, so first, why should they submit on time? There's an easy answer, which is they have signed the Paris Agreement. They have promised to deliver on time. But that's a very mechanistic take. I think it's important that they deliver on time because it's about the signals that we're sending to the rest of community as well. We want to create stable expectations of where policy is going in order for both policy and technology to develop on the desired path, kind of. And what was your other question? Sorry, I forgot.
It's about, wait, what needs to what do countries need to change anything just to follow the like exact timeline of the Paris Agreement of the NDC submission? What do they need to adjust?
Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you. I touched on this earlier a little bit. Some of the things that we suggest in the paper are related to, again, targeted capacity building, which we have talked about a little bit, so I won't go into that in detail. But I think that is one of the major things, and it could be supported by a range of different actors, both state and non-state actors could play a part here. Then there's also the idea or the question of separating the headline targets from the rest of the NDC's more complex, heavy part of it, which means that like the headline target is when the country is saying we are going to reduce 60% from 1990 levels, for instance, and then having that separate from the rest of the NDC where they say how they're going to do it. That's just an idea. Maybe it should be discussed, maybe it shouldn't. Maybe it's a bad idea, I don't know. And lastly, if we are kind of lacking a climate leader at the moment. As I see it, China is maybe the closest thing to being a climate leader at the moment, especially in terms of yes, they have very high emissions, but they are also developing technology at a rate that is not comparable to any other country. And as we're seeing now with the energy crisis as a consequence of the war in Iran, I saw Pakistan has bought a lot, like so much, invested in so much solar panels, Chinese solar panels. And India was also talking about doing the same to kind of offset some of their vulnerability to Middle Eastern oil and gas. But yeah, there's room for a climate leader to step up and try and inspire or pull the others along. But I also think it's important to hold policymakers accountable and that civil society keeps up the pressure on and keeps talking about climate, even though there's so much else going on, because we're all going to be better off if we tackle climate change sooner rather than later. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I also agree with you, Malin, and I am also taking you back to your previous comments regarding to provide the targeted capacity building, especially not only for, maybe not only for the government, maybe the capacity building is also needed for the community as well. So we all can have a comprehensive awareness on how urgent is the issue of climate change and how urgent is the multi-stakeholder cooperation under the climate initiatives or the commitment to reach upon the climate targets that has been published by the country itself. Maybe could you share with us, do you have like what kind of targeted capacity building that maybe you have an experience on it, or that can we learn as developing countries to set up this awareness on climate and to accelerate the implementation of the NDC?
If I had the answer to that would be great. I think there's a lot to learn. I think countries have a lot to learn from each other, and if they could find the time and resources to set the time and resources aside to try and cooperate more closely on monitoring their emissions across sectors, but also in learning how to. And there are programs like this already, like the UNFCCC offers capacity building assistance, but it just seems that it's not enough. And oftentimes, from what we're seeing, You have in a country, in a climate and energy ministry, for instance, you can have one person whose responsibility it is to develop the NDC. And that is an enormous task for one person. And it requires that they are very, very competent, a lot more competent than I am, that's for sure. And that they are able to cooperate with the rest of the rest of government, basically. So resources to get more people to pull to carry this burden is also important, I think.
All right, thank you, Malin, for your answer. Yes, I think I do agree with you that capacity building is one of the important activities to raise awareness and also to share best practices. I think, and that's how we do it in ASEAN, especially ACE with our like many activities related with workshops and trainings on climate. And if I can mention the ASEAN Climate Change and Energy Project, or ACCEP, is currently doing that. We also have study tour program which share best practices on, especially for the policymaker to learn from the leading climate countries. In this case, is Norway, to learn on how to arrange and tailor a policy that is comprehensive and could be aligned with other initiatives or other ministries as well. And yeah, I think my final question is regarding your findings. How can countries improve the credibility of their climate commitments?
They can, this is a bit flippant, but they can follow through on them. They can, that would improve credibility, but I think the NDCs are designed to facilitate credible implementation, to give information about how they're going to achieve their targets, which is great. But there's no doubt that we need climate finance, and we need developed countries supporting developing countries, and we need private industry as well. We need to mobilize private finance as well. And it does seem, with everything going on, that we are not focusing so much on it, but hopefully we will be able to meet the targets that the agreement sets up on this. And I think it's also important to remember that there are opportunities and co-benefits arising from a green transition done well. And I'm just hoping that we will act sooner rather than later to ensure as fair a transition as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I think like we discussed on our previous discussion, Malin, several international initiatives such as the Climate Club, maybe
Yeah.
can also accelerating the how to say, the awareness, especially on the government, because I think it's an intergovernmental forum, right? To exchange, or do you have any thoughts on it?
Yeah, the idea of climate clubs has been floating around for 10, 15 years, or maybe even longer. I don't know, probably longer. But and what a climate club should look like varies from who you ask. But the idea is that a climate club can take over as a front runner country. We can get together like a group of ambitious countries who are keen on doing well on implementation can get together and create a community with, and then how exactly this should look like varies as well. But one idea is that you can pull in trade, and you can, the members of the club can have a most favored nations trading relation, so they can have lower trade barriers against each other, for instance, because then you will get, and these benefits, these material benefits, are tied to their emissions reduction, how well they're doing. But there are issues with this. There are practical hurdles to this, like I think you need an economist to comment on it, and what will the WTO say? We have trade rules in the international system, and I think they might have to be adopted if we're going to have a climate club like this up and running. But it is an interesting idea, I think. I haven't done any research myself on this idea, but from what I have read, it's something that people are exploring, and it's going to be interesting to see if any suggestions are coming up, any concrete suggestions.
Yeah, I think I also interested of the idea of the climate club, as you mentioned earlier, but I think we still don't have it yet in terms of like regional level, or maybe in the future ASEAN can also. We only have like ASEAN Working Group on Climate Change, which is consisting of the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change of like the 11 ASEAN countries, but that's the only like official platform established by the government to provide and support the discussion of the climate conversation in ASEAN countries. So I think yes, there should be more initiatives that maybe can push the government or the policymaker to establish more and more regulation, especially on the monitoring system, to keep up with the climate commitments that the countries has agreed. So thank you, Malin. I think that's all. Thank you for answering my questions. I do apologize if there are so many questions that asked during our session, but due to the limited time, I do have to end the session. And thank you very much, Malin and all the audience. I will give it back to Aisha.
Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you very much, Ms. Indira. Thank you very much, Ms. Malin, for the insightful discussion. I would like to say that there are lots of questions that were asked, and those questions really guide us through thinking further on how this climate change, the delays, and the pledges that these state parties are binded with really affect the credibility as well as efforts to enhance their reliance on this climate pledges. And I think I believe this is not only me who have gained this insightful discussion. All the participants here have gained insightful ideas from the discussion and question and answer session with you, Malin. And so before we conclude our session, I would like to invite Ms. Malin and Ms. Indira, the both of you, to a brief photo session. And so please, Ms. Malin and Ms. Indira, please get ready and share your brightest smile for the camera as I will lead this photo session. All right, I believe that the operator is ready. So I'd like to count with 1, 2, 3. All right, maybe just one more photo in 3, 2, and 1. Right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Malin, and thank you very much, Ms. Indira. I would like to thank the both of you for sharing your insights. Ms. Malin, thank you very much for sharing your publication regarding the delays in submission of NDCs, what constraints results, and how does it apply to states' efforts. And thank you very much for everyone for being part of today's session. We hope that the discussion has offered a new insights and valuable perspectives over the news regarding the indices. And so I would like to close the session. Please stay connected with us through our social media channels, newsletter, and website to keep up with the latest updates regarding ARNECC and the development within ASEAN's energy and climate landscape. And therefore, I am Aisha Hasmiat. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we look forward to welcoming you again at our upcoming ARNECC webinars. Thank you very much, and good afternoon from Indonesia.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Malin.
Thank you so much, Indira and Aisha.